Millhaven, Kansas Territory, October 1884. Maren Stoll, 27 years old, had spent the better part of 10 months learning a particular kind of discipline, the discipline of not looking at things she couldn't have. She had gotten very good at it by October. She stood on the boardwalk outside Fenwick's dry goods, with Theo's hand in hers, her boy 9 years old and quiet beside her, his face turned toward the store window, with the kind of stillness a child only manages when something has caught him so completely he's forgotten to pretend otherwise. His eyes were fixed on a pair of boys' lace-up boots displayed on a wooden stand just inside the glass. Brown leather, sturdy soles, exactly the size his feet had grown into sometime around August, when Maren hadn't had the money to do anything about it. Theo's current boots were stuffed with folded newspaper at the toes to keep the cold from coming through where the leather had worn thin. He hadn't complained. He was 9 years old, and he already understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that some things cost more than they had right now. Maren squeezed his hand once. "Come on, sweetheart," she said quietly. And she steered him away from the window without once looking at the boots herself, because she had already looked at them, once, on a morning, 3 weeks back, when she'd priced them at $3.40, and known exactly what $3.40 meant against the $14 still owed to Fenwick on her late husband, James's account. Looking a second time wouldn't change the number. It would only make the walk home longer. She didn't see the man across the street watching. Hugh Mabry was 48 years old, had been running his cattle operation 6 miles south of Millhaven for the better part of 22 years, and had grown up with a specific kind of poverty that a person doesn't forget. Not because poverty is something worth memorializing, but because the body remembers it independently of the mind's willingness to move on. He'd been 12 when his father's back gave out for the last time, and the family's small claim near Abilene stopped being anything a 12-year-old boy and a tired woman could manage between them. He remembered his mother counting coins on a kitchen table and then putting most of them back in the jar without comment. He remembered wearing boots 2 sizes too large through an entire winter, because they were what the church box had in his approximate range. The toes stuffed with rags to keep them from sliding. He remembered, most clearly of all, the exact set of his mother's shoulders when she walked past something she couldn't afford, the way she'd learned not to look directly at it, because looking was a kind of grief she didn't have time for. He recognized that same discipline now in the set of a 27-year-old woman's shoulders as she walked her boy away from a dry goods window on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Hugh crossed the street and went inside Fenwick's. He came back out 7 minutes later with a paper-wrapped parcel tied with string. He found Maren Stoll 20 yards down the boardwalk, helping Theo button his coat against the October wind, and he stopped in front of them with the straightforward manner of a man who had decided something before he fully thought it through. "Ma'am, pardon the interruption. I bought these for my sister's boy back in August, and the size isn't right after all. He's been growing faster than I can track." He held the parcel out. "They look like they might suit your son better than sitting in my saddlebag." Maren looked at the parcel. She looked at the shape of it, which was unmistakably the shape of a shoebox. She looked at Hugh Mabry, 48 years old, a man she had seen at church twice and at the grain exchange once, and she understood immediately and completely that no man bought the wrong boot size for a nephew and then happened to carry the evidence of his mistake down Main Street on the same afternoon. She started to say no. Then she looked at Theo's feet. The newspaper stuffed into the toes of his boots had shifted in the cold, and one side was visibly bunched against the leather. Her boy was standing straight and patient, and not saying a single word about it. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully. "We couldn't." "I'd take it as a favor," Hugh said, his voice level and without pressure. Otherwise, they sit unused, and that seems a worse waste. Theo was looking at the parcel with an expression Maren hadn't seen on his face in a long time. "Thank you," she said. "We will." She found out his name by asking Agnes Kerr, who ran the boarding house where Maren rented her two-room arrangement and who knew the history of most of Millhaven without being asked. Hugh Mabry, widower, lost his wife Eleanor 4 years back to a fever that moved too fast for the doctor to catch. No children of his own, ran a clean, solvent operation. Quiet man, kept his word. James Stoll had died in March, swept off a ferry crossing in a flooding river on a Tuesday that had started like any other Tuesday. He had left Maren with Theo, a rented room, a sewing basket, and a debt at Fenwick's General Supply that had seemed manageable when James was alive and the income was coming, and had revealed its true size only after the bank visit in June, when the grief was still close enough to the surface that numbers felt unreal. Bernard Fenwick was 61 years old and ran his General Supply the way he ran most things in Millhaven, with the patience of a man whose patience was actually arithmetic. He had let the Stoll account sit through the summer. He had not been unkind about it. But in October, he received an offer to sell the account to a creditor in Wichita, and the offer expired at month's end, and he came to Maren's door on a Wednesday morning to tell her so, with the expression of a man who has already decided the transaction is complete. Maren stood in the doorway with Theo half asleep behind her, and $14.20 still owed, and listened to Fenwick explain that the Wichita buyer expected settlement by October 28th, 11 days away, and that if she couldn't clear the balance, the account would transfer, and she'd be dealing with a creditor who was not, he felt he should warn her, as familiar with her circumstances as he was. She had cleared $4.80 since March. Laundering, mending, alterations for 3 of the ranch wives east of town. She had stopped eating full meals herself in September, on the days when Theo's portion needed to stretch further than the food allowed. She had told Theo she'd eaten while she worked, a small lie so practiced by October that it barely felt like a lie anymore. $14 in 11 days was not a number that had a solution in it. Hugh Mabry was already bringing her mending work by then. Work shirts, a leather vest that needed new stitching along the seams, a wool saddle blanket that had frayed at both ends. He paid in advance and without comment. Maren noticed the pattern by the 3rd piece and said nothing, understanding it for what it was, and choosing gratitude over the correction she would have made in an easier season. Theo had started coming along when she delivered the finished work to the Mabry ranch, and Hugh had taken the time to show him how to read weather in cloud formations and which fence posts needed resetting before winter, and how to test whether a water trough's seam would hold. Theo asked questions in the careful, deliberate way of a boy who had learned not to assume his questions were welcome, and Hugh answered each one with the patience of a man who had nowhere more important to be. Maren watched her son's shoulders drop from somewhere around his ears one afternoon in early October and realized she had not seen them that low since February, since before. "He hasn't talked that much in months," she told Hugh, watching Theo explain something serious to one of the barn cats with the focused earnestness of a 9-year-old who has found a willing audience. "He's got a lot to say," Hugh said simply. "Just needed somewhere it would land." She found out about Hugh's visit to Fenwick's office the same way she found out about most things in Millhaven, through Agnes Kerr, who mentioned it without realizing she was delivering news the way people do when they assume everyone already knows. Maren arrived at the Mabry ranch that same evening with a finished vest under her arm and a jaw set in a way Theo recognized from a distance and wisely chose to give space to. "You went to Fenwick," she said, before she'd stepped down from the wagon. Hugh was mending fence along the east pasture and straightened up slowly without rushing the moment. "I did." "Without asking me." Her voice was level in the way voices get when the steadiness is being held deliberately. "That debt is mine, Hugh. It has my name on it. My husband put it there, and I am the one who answers for it, and you had no right to walk into that office and make it into something I needed rescuing from." "You're right that I should have asked you first," Hugh said. "I won't argue that. I have done laundry in the dark, so Theo didn't see me crying while I worked it," Maren said, and her voice caught once before she steadied it again. "I have gone to bed without supper more nights than I'll tell you. I have kept that boy from knowing how close we are to the edge of it, because a 9-year-old doesn't need to carry that weight, and I made that choice on my own, because it was mine to make, and I will not have you decide that the most useful thing you can do is go solve it for me behind my back like I'm a problem someone else needs to manage." Hugh was quiet a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't thinking of a response so much as sitting with the full weight of what had been said. "You're right," he said finally. "Every word of it. I got scared of Theo losing his home, and I moved on that fear instead of asking what you needed. That's my failure, not yours." He set the fence pliers down on the post and looked at her directly. "What I told Fenwick wasn't that someone else was paying your debt. I told him you had a working trade and a steady income, and that he'd collect his money surer from you over 6 months than from a Wichita creditor who didn't know your work from a hole in the ground. That decision is still yours to make, but I should have brought it to you before I brought it to him. I'm sorry." Maren held that for a moment. Something in the plainness of it. No explanation that slid sideways into excuse, no reasoning that softened the apology back into justification, let some of the held tension out of her shoulders. "Show me what you told him," she said, "and then we do the rest together or not at all. I want the debt restructured, not paid off for me. My hands, my time, my own work, that's what clears it. Nothing else mixed in." "That's exactly what I told him we'd bring," Hugh said. "Didn't presume further than that. I want to pause here for just a moment, if you'll allow me. This story has traveled further than I expected when I first sat down to tell it. I've heard from folks in Georgia and Minnesota and the Carolinas, and from places across this world I'm still learning my way around. If Maren and Hugh and young Theo are keeping you good company tonight, a like means more than you know, and I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, there's still the matter of October 28th and Bernard Fenwick's deadline, and a deputy who showed up at the wrong moment for the right reasons. They went to Fenwick together on the 26th, 2 days before the deadline. Maren carried a leather folder containing letters from 7 women, ranch wives, the school teacher, and the minister's wife, each one a written commitment to alterations and seasonal work through the following year. Together, they represented steady, documented income, more reliable in their consistency than a third of the trade accounts Fenwick carried on his own books. A deputy from the county office had come along, sent as a formality in case the situation required legal presence. He stood near the door looking like a man who had arrived expecting a short errand and was beginning to suspect otherwise. Fenwick read through the folder without speaking. The office was quiet enough that Maren could hear the clock on the wall marking the seconds. "This is your work," Fenwick said finally, looking at Maren directly rather than at Hugh, "not his." "Every stitch of it," Maren said. "Mr. Mabry carried the folder. The names in it belong to me." Bernard Fenwick was 61 years old and had been in commerce long enough to know the difference between a debt worth pressing and a debtor worth backing. He tapped the folder slowly against his desk. When he spoke again, his voice had come down from its business register into something quieter. "My own wife took in ironing the winter after her father's dry goods store went under," he said. "I was 7 years old. I used to think she was just keeping herself busy." He was quiet a moment. I understood what it actually cost her considerably later than I should have. He set the folder down. 6 months, he said. Same rate, no penalties. Secured against this income rather than any property. I'll have the new terms written by Friday. The deputy near the door shifted his hat and left without ceremony, looking considerably relieved to have become unnecessary. Maren stood on Fenwick's front step for a long moment after, the folder under her arm and the October air sharp and clean around her, and tried to find the word for what she was feeling. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than relief. The particular feeling of ground that isn't moving. You still should have asked me before you went to him the first time, she told Hugh. I know it, he said. Got that part wrong. Tried to get the second part right. You did, she said. It was a plain acknowledgement, not a larger thing than that, but Hugh heard it for what it was. She opened her dress shop the following March in a narrow storefront 2 doors down from the post office, the 7 letters framed on the wall behind the counter, which some customers assumed was decoration, and which Maren let them think. She hired a second seamstress within the year, a widow named June, 29, who needed steady work and fair pay, and who received both without being made to feel the weight of needing them. Maren made a quiet point of paying her on Fridays without fail. Always in full. Always without commentary on the circumstances that had brought either of them to that arrangement. Theo grew up at the Mabry ranch as much as he grew up anywhere, calling Hugh by his first name until he was 11, and then shifting, without anyone asking him to, into something else that fit better and that nobody made a ceremony of. He learned cattle and fence wire and weather and the particular patience required to wait out a Kansas winter without losing your nerve, and carried those things forward the way a child does when he's been allowed to learn them somewhere that felt safe enough to get things wrong. Hugh and Maren married the following January in a small service at the Millhaven church, with Agnes Kerr in the second pew and Bernard Fenwick standing near the back, looking considerably more moved than a restructured credit arrangement typically left a man looking. He told anyone who asked that he'd simply made a sound business decision. He never quite managed to explain, when pressed, why sound business decisions made him stand up straighter when the vows were spoken. Maren kept, in a cedar box on the top shelf of the shop's back room, a length of brown paper string, the string from the parcel Hugh had carried across the street on that Tuesday in October. The boots themselves Theo had long since outgrown. The string she kept because it marked, she told the few people she chose to tell, the first time someone had looked at her boy and seen what he needed without being asked, and had moved on, that seeing before the decision had fully finished forming. Not a rescue, not a grand gesture, just a man who recognized something he had once been himself and did not look away. 20 years before Hugh Mabry walked into Fenwick's dry goods, he was the boy with newspapers stuffed in his boots, watching his mother learn not to look at things she couldn't buy. That's the part that makes the string worth keeping. Not the $3.40, the memory that lived in his hands when he picked those boots up and carried them across the street. And Maren spent 10 months insisting she needed nothing from anyone, and she wasn't wrong to insist on it. Dignity held on to carefully through a hard season is sometimes the only architecture a person has left standing. But the thing that changed the trajectory of that year wasn't Hugh solving a problem for her. It was Hugh learning, in one hard conversation, with one clean apology, no qualifications attached, the difference between deciding what someone needs and asking them first. Most people, when they get that wrong, spend the rest of their lives explaining why they weren't really wrong. The willingness to simply say so without the explanation is rarer than it ought to be. That's not a small thing in a man. It's not a small thing in a story. Thank you for riding along with me tonight, friend. Whether you're sitting in a farmhouse in the heartland or somewhere far across this wide world, I'm grateful for your company and your time. May your week ahead be gentle. May the people around you have the good sense to ask before they act, and the grace to say sorry plainly when they don't. Until next time, God bless you and yours. Keep riding.